This HOA Karen called the cops the second I returned to my mountain mansion early. And what I found was a living nightmare. Lights on, groceries on my counter, and a strange woman in my bathrobe telling me I was the one trespassing. She actually called 911 right in front of me, waving forged documents and screaming that she had emergency authority to take over my home. But while she was playing the victim, she had no idea I was about to uncover the secret business she'd been running from my house for the past 2 weeks. How do you prove you own your home when a stranger has the police on her side? Where are you watching from? Drop a comment, because this story is insane. The Arizona sun felt good on my face. For the first 2 weeks of July, my home was a 30-foot RV parked at the edge of a dusty canyon, and my only job was to watch the shadows grow long. After 40 years of sirens and smoke, the quiet was a kind of medicine. I'd wake up, make coffee, and just sit. My wife, Eleanor, had always loved this about the desert, the sheer, uncomplicated emptiness of it all. Since she'd been gone, I'd found myself coming back to these quiet places, trying to find what she saw in them. I was about to pour a second cup when my phone buzzed on the little fold-out table. It was an email alert from the mountain water utility back home. Not a bill, just a notification. I almost swiped it away, figuring it was junk mail. But the subject line caught my eye. High usage alert for your property. That didn't make any sense. The house was empty. The main valve to the irrigation system was shut off. The only thing that should have been using water was the ice maker, and that was just a slow drip. I opened the email. According to their smart meter, my property had used over 3,000 gallons of water in the last week. My mind, trained for decades to run through checklists, immediately started sorting the possibilities. A burst pipe in the wall? Possible. But the leak detector I installed should have sent a separate alert and shut off the main. A faulty sprinkler valve stuck open? I'd closed the main myself before leaving. A running toilet? That wouldn't use 3,000 gallons. I sat there for a minute, the desert silence suddenly feeling less peaceful and more like an absence. A retired firefighter knows the difference between a problem and a puzzle. A puzzle you can solve at your leisure. A problem needs your attention right now, before it gets worse. 3,000 gallons of water, going somewhere it shouldn't, was a problem. I packed up the RV in under an hour. The 500-mile drive back home was a slow climb from the flat, sun-baked earth of Arizona into the cool, pine-scented mountains of my home state. Every mile I drove, I replayed the water usage numbers. It wasn't a single, catastrophic event, like a main break. The chart showed consistent, daily usage. Peaks in the morning, a lull during the day, and another spike in the evening. It looked exactly like the pattern of someone living there. Showering, washing dishes, flushing toilets. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, but the feeling in my gut, the one that tells you a ladder is about to slip or a floor is about to give way, that feeling was getting stronger. I turned off the main highway onto the winding 2-lane road that led up the mountain. This was my sanctuary. I'd bought the land with my fire department pension and spent 5 years building the house myself, right after Eleanor passed. It was my monument to her, to us, a place of peace. As I pulled up to the main gate, I felt a knot in my stomach begin to loosen. Everything looked normal. The heavy wrought iron gate was closed. The stone pillars stood solid. The pines swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. Home. I keyed in the code. The gate hummed open smoothly. But as I drove through, I glanced at the keypad out of habit. There were smudges on the numbers. Greasy, fresh fingerprints, clearly visible in the sunlight. I never left smudges. I knew the code by heart. My fingers barely had to touch the buttons. I stopped the truck and walked back to the keypad. I also checked the small, discrete driveway sensor I'd installed, which logs every time a vehicle passes over the magnetic strip buried in the asphalt. I pulled up the log on my phone. My heart started beating a little faster. There were entries, multiple entries, nearly every day for the past 2 weeks. Starting on July 3rd, the day after I'd left. Little timestamps of intrusion. July 3rd, 9:14 a.m. July 4th, 6:22 p.m. July 5th, 9:01 a.m. and 9:27 a.m. And so on. Over and over. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation. The tree trimmers. I'd hired a crew a couple of months back to clear some branches away from the roof. Maybe they had leftover work? I gave them the gate code, but I told them to call me before they came. I scrolled through my phone. No missed calls, no voicemails, no texts from them. My first instinct, the firefighter instinct, was to call the sheriff's office right then and there. Report a possible break-in. But I needed to know what I was dealing with first. You don't pull the alarm until you see the smoke. I parked my truck and walked toward the front door. The house was silent. No broken windows, no pried open doors. Everything looked just as I'd left it. I put my key in the lock. It turned smoothly. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. And that's when the world tilted on its axis. The air inside wasn't stale and still. It was warm and carried the faint scent of coffee and, was that bacon? The living room lights were on. From the den, I could hear the low murmur of a television, a daytime talk show, by the sound of it. My gaze drifted to the kitchen counter. There was a loaf of bread, a bag of apples, and a carton of milk sitting next to the sink. They weren't my brands. My house, the quiet sanctuary I had built with my own hands, was occupied. Someone was not just trespassing on my property, they were living in my home. And I had a terrible, sinking feeling that I was about to find out who. My hand was already in my pocket, fingers closing around my phone to dial 911, when I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. Years of running into burning buildings taught me to stop, listen, and assess before acting. The television host was still babbling in the den, a cheerful, oblivious sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. I stayed perfectly still, my back against the closed front door, trying to pinpoint the sound. Another creak, this time on the main staircase. Someone was coming down. My heart hammered against my ribs, a steady, heavy beat. I wasn't scared, not in the way most people think. It was the familiar, cold focus that comes when a situation is about to turn sideways. My thumb found the side button of my phone, ready to make the call. That's when she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. It was Karen Whitfield, the HOA president. But she wasn't wearing her usual uniform of a brightly colored pantsuit and a look of pursed-lipped disapproval. She was wearing my bathrobe. My heavy terry cloth robe, the one Eleanor had given me for Christmas 10 years ago. It was cinched tightly around her waist, and her feet were stuffed into a pair of my slippers. Her face was a mask of caked-on foundation and bright red lipstick, slightly smeared at the corner. She looked at me, not with the shock of a trespasser caught in the act, but with the indignation of a queen whose private chambers had been breached. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, one hand on her hip, and said, "Can I help you?" For a second, the sheer absurdity of it all left me speechless. I could only stare at her, standing in my foyer, wearing my clothes, asking me if I needed help. "Karen," I finally managed to say, my voice low and steady, "what are you doing in my house?" She let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Your house? I think you're mistaken. I'm here under the emergency authority granted to me as the board president of this community. We had reports of an abandoned property, and according to the bylaws, it is my duty to secure and maintain it to protect community standards." I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. Panic is a luxury you can't afford in an emergency. Abandoned? I've been gone for 2 weeks on a planned vacation, Karen. You have my phone number? You have my email? Nobody contacted me. She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture of pure arrogance. You were away without filing the proper notice. The rules are very clear, Mark. Section C. Paragraph 12. Extended absences require board notification. For all we knew, something could have happened to you. This property was at risk. She started walking toward me, her voice rising with a strange, rehearsed confidence. That's when I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a performance. Without another word, she pulled a small, pearl-colored phone from the pocket of my bathrobe and dialed 911. Her voice became high-pitched and frantic. Yes, hello? I need the police immediately. There's a man in my house. He just walked in the front door. I'm at 12 Mountain View Ridge. She paused, listening, then added, He seems unstable. He's claiming he owns the property. Please hurry. I'm very frightened. She was looking right at me as she said it, a faint, triumphant smirk on her lips. It was the most brazen act I had ever witnessed. My training kicked in. Instead of yelling, instead of arguing, I calmly took out my own phone. I didn't call anyone. I opened the camera app and pressed record. The little red dot appeared in the corner of my screen. I held the phone up, keeping it steady. Karen, I said, my voice as even as I could make it. You're on camera. I suggest you hang up the phone. She ignored me, continuing her performance for the dispatcher. He's threatening me now. He's recording me. I slowly panned the phone around the living room, capturing the groceries on the counter, the television playing in the den, and finally, the large, framed document hanging on the wall right next to the staircase. It was the title deed to the house and the land, with my name, Mark Jensen, printed in clear, official type. I zoomed in on it for a long, silent moment before pointing the camera back at her. The deed to this house is on the wall, Karen. My name is on it. You are trespassing. Just then, the distant wail of a siren cut through the air. Within minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies were at my door. One was young, cautious. The other was older, Deputy Alan Ruiz, a man I recognized from community meetings. He had a reputation for being thorough, if a bit slow to act. Karen rushed to them, a picture of a damsel in distress, clutching my bathrobe to her chest. Thank God you're here, officers. This man, he just walked in. I've been staying here to protect the property for the HOA. Deputy Ruiz held up a hand, a sign for calm. He looked from her to me. Sir, can you tell me what's going on? I lowered my phone but didn't stop recording. My name is Mark Jensen. This is my home. I've been on vacation and just returned to find this woman living here. I gestured to the deed on the wall. That's the title. My driver's license is in my wallet. Everything matches. Ruiz nodded slowly, his face unreadable. He looked at Karen. Ma'am? And that's when she played her card. She produced a sheaf of papers from the same robe pocket. I have the official documentation, officer, she said, her voice dripping with authority. She handed him a document printed on heavy paper with the HOA's official letterhead at the top. I could see the title from where I stood. Emergency Transfer of Temporary Occupancy. It was filled with legal-sounding gibberish about property abandonment, board authority, and community bylaws. At the bottom, in a neat, flowing script, was Karen Whitfield's signature. It was a complete and utter fabrication, a piece of paper she'd invented to justify her crime, but it looked official. To a cop standing in a stranger's foyer, it looked official enough to create doubt. Deputy Ruiz read the paper, his brow furrowed. He looked at my deed on the wall, then back at the forged document in his hand. He was stuck. A classic he said, she said, but with paperwork. And in his world, paperwork held weight. I saw the hesitation in his eyes. In that moment, I realized my problem wasn't a simple squatter in a bathrobe. I was up against someone who had a plan. Someone who knew how to use the rules as a weapon. This wasn't just my house she was trying to take. It was my name, my rights, my peace, and the fight had just begun. Arguing with Karen on my own doorstep while a sheriff's deputy stood between us was a battle I was going to lose. Her fake document, no matter how absurd, had introduced just enough doubt to turn a criminal matter into a civil one. Deputy Ruiz made that clear. "Mr. Jensen, I understand your position," he said, his voice low and apologetic. "But with this document from the HOA, my hands are tied. You'll have to take this to the courts." Karen stood behind him, a smug, satisfied look on her face. Pushing past them, getting into a shouting match, or forcing my way into my own home would only get me arrested. That's what she wanted. She was baiting a trap, and I wasn't going to walk into it. I gave Ruiz a simple nod. "I understand, Deputy." Then I turned, walked back to my truck, and drove it just outside my gate, parking it on the shoulder of the road. I decided to retreat, but not to surrender. A fire isn't fought with anger. It's fought with a plan, with tools, and with a calm head. My RV was now my command center, and my new mission was to gather so much evidence that no one, not a deputy and not a judge, could have any doubt about the truth. I sat at the small dinette table in the RV, my laptop open, and began to build my case, piece by piece. The first step was the paper trail. I started with the water utility alert that brought me home. I logged into my account and downloaded the daily usage report for the past month. The graph was stark. From June 1st to July 20th, the line was flat, showing almost zero usage. On July 3rd, it spiked, and then settled into a rhythmic pattern of peaks and valleys, the unmistakable signature of someone showering, cooking, and doing laundry. Next, I pulled up the electric company's website. It was the exact same story. For the entire month of June, my daily usage was a couple of kilowatt hours, just enough to power the fridge and security system. Starting on July 3rd, the usage shot up tenfold. I printed both graphs, facts, undeniable facts. Next came the video. I had 2 cameras on the property, one pointed at the front door and another covering the garage. They uploaded footage to a cloud server, so even if someone destroyed the cameras, the recordings were safe. I scrolled back through the logs to July 3rd, 9:14 a.m., the exact time the driveway sensor first logged an entry. And there she was. The video was crystal clear. Karen Whitfield, pulling her sedan right up to the front porch, getting out and using a key to open my front door. A few minutes later, she returned to her car and started unloading 2 large, heavy suitcases. This wasn't a wellness check or a property inspection. This was someone moving in. I downloaded the file and saved it. I then remembered that my neighbor across the street, a quiet man named Mr. Harrison, had a Ring camera. I walked over and explained the situation. He was hesitant at first, not wanting to get involved in HOA drama, but when I told him a stranger was living in my house, his attitude changed. Together, we reviewed his footage. His camera had a perfect view of my driveway. We found the footage from July 3rd. It showed Karen's car arriving, and it caught something my camera didn't. Her struggling to punch in the gate code multiple times before it finally opened. She didn't know it well. She was an outsider. Mr. Harrison, a veteran who valued property rights as much as I did, emailed me the video file without another word. The final piece of the puzzle required an expert. I called my friend Dave Harlan, a retired electrician who had helped me wire the entire house. "Dave," I said, "you know that smart breaker panel you had me install? Can you get data off of it?" An hour later he was sitting beside me in the RV, his own laptop plugged into my system. "Oh yeah," he said with a grin. "This thing tells a story." He showed me the logs. He could see exactly which circuits were drawing power and when. "Look here, Mark," he said, pointing at the screen. "Every weekday morning at 7:05 a.m., there's a 500-watt power draw from the kitchen circuit. That's your coffee maker. Then at 7:08, another spike from a different outlet. That's the toaster. At night, Around 6:30 p.m., the big 4,000-watt circuit for the oven kicks on for about an hour. This isn't just proof that someone is in the house. This is proof of a daily routine. This is a person living here. The next morning, I took my binder of evidence, the utility bills, the time-stamped video logs, and a signed, notarized statement from Dave explaining the electrical data to the sheriff's station. Deputy Ruiz met me in a small, quiet interview room. I laid everything out on the table, not with anger, but with cold, methodical precision. I showed him the video of Karen with her suitcases. I showed him the utility graphs. I walked him through Dave's report. As he reviewed the documents, his professional mask of neutrality began to crack. He looked up at me, his eyes showing the first glimmer of understanding. "This is very thorough, Mr. Jensen," he said. He nodded slowly. "This changes things. Let me make some calls." For the first time in 2 days, I felt a wave of hope. The system was slow, but it was starting to work. The facts were on my side, but my hope was short-lived. That evening, back in my RV, an email popped up on my phone. It was an official blast from the HOA board to all residents. The subject line read, "Community Safety Notice." I opened it. My blood ran cold. The notice, signed by the entire HOA board, stated that the property at 12 Mountain View Ridge was under temporary HOA stewardship due to owner abandonment and potential code violations. It went on to state that an unauthorized individual, whom they identified as me, Mark Jensen, had been attempting to forcibly occupy the residence and had exhibited erratic and concerning behavior. They warned all residents to avoid contact with me and to report any suspicious activity to the HOA, the sheriff's office. They had twisted my return into an attack. They had backed Karen's lie, institutionalized it, and broadcast it to the entire neighborhood. I was no longer just fighting Karen. I was fighting the entire HOA, and they had just painted a target on my back. The HOA's email was a declaration of war, and it had its intended effect. The next morning when I walked to the community mailbox, neighbors who would normally wave either turned away or gave me a short, nervous nod. I was no longer Mark Jensen, the retired firefighter who kept his yard neat. I was now the unauthorized individual, a potential threat. My quiet mountain community had become hostile territory. Karen wasn't just content with seizing my home. She was systematically destroying my reputation. A few hours later, a text message came in from Mr. Harrison. It was a screenshot from the official community Facebook group. Karen had posted a long, rambling message. She talked about her solemn duty to uphold property values, and then took a personal shot at me. "It is with a heavy heart," she wrote, "that I must inform the community that Mr. Jensen appears to be suffering from some kind of mental distress. His recent erratic behavior is a security concern for us all. Please keep your doors locked." Reading those words felt like a punch in the gut. She was painting me as unstable, a crazy old man who didn't even know he didn't own his own home. It was a calculated move to isolate me, to make sure no one would listen to my side of the story. The attacks kept coming. The next day, another neighbor, a kind woman named Linda Green, whose husband had passed a few years back, quietly slipped a piece of paper under the windshield wiper of my truck. It was a memo, again on official HOA letterhead. Karen had distributed it to a select few neighbors she considered allies. The memo called for an emergency board meeting, with only one item on the agenda: a vote to reclaim abandoned property at 12 Mountain View Ridge and transfer title to the Homeowners Association for community use. It was a fantasy, a legal impossibility. You can't just vote to take someone's house. But the document, with its formal language and forged signature lines for the board members, was designed to intimidate and confuse. She was building a fortress of lies, one fake document at a time. I sat in my RV that night, the binder of evidence open on the table and I kept coming back to one simple question. Why? The risk she was taking was enormous. Squatting in a house was one thing, but orchestrating a smear campaign and forging documents was a whole other level. It couldn't just be for a place to stay. There had to be money involved. On a hunch, I opened my laptop and started searching. I went to the big short-term rental websites. I typed in the name of our town and zoomed in on my neighborhood. I scrolled through listings of log cabins and A-frames. And then, I saw it. My heart stopped. It was a picture of my living room. The listing was called Mountain Luxe Escapes by Kate. The photos were professional, showcasing the stone fireplace I built, the view from the deck Eleanor and I designed, and even my bedroom, with the sheets turned down neatly. Karen, or Kate, had staged my home and was renting it out as a luxury vacation spot. The price was listed at $450 a night. I clicked on the calendar. It was almost fully booked for the 2 weeks I was gone. I scrolled down to the reviews. An absolutely stunning property. The views are incredible. Kate was a wonderful host. The review was dated July 7th. Another one, dated July 12th, said, "Peace and quiet in a gorgeous home. We will definitely be back." Every review, every booked night, was a transaction that took place while she was claiming the house was abandoned. I did the math quickly. At least 14 nights booked at $450 a night. That was $300. This wasn't about community standards. This was about greed. This was fraud, plain and simple. I spent the next hour taking screenshots of everything. The listing, the photos, the reviews, the host profile, the booking calendar. I printed every single one and added them to my binder. The next morning, I was back at Deputy Ruiz's desk. I didn't say a word. I just opened the binder to the Airbnb section and pushed it across the table. He looked at the first page, then the second, his eyes widening. He picked up a screenshot of the reviews and compared the dates to the utility bills I had already given him. They lined up perfectly. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is wire fraud. Grand theft. This is no longer a civil dispute." A wave of relief washed over me. This was the proof he couldn't ignore. "So, you can go and arrest her now?" I asked. He shook his head slowly, and my heart sank. "It doesn't work that way, Mark. This elevates the case. It has to go to the state's fraud and cybercrime division. I'll file the report immediately, and I'll mark it as urgent. But I'll be honest with you. These investigations can take weeks, sometimes months. They have to get warrants for the rental company's records, subpoena her bank accounts. It's a process. Weeks? I had to live in my truck for weeks while she was making thousands of dollars a week sleeping in my bed? It felt like a deep injustice, but I understood procedure. I had the truth on my side. All I had to do was wait. That evening, after a long day of making more copies of my evidence at a local print shop, I drove back up the mountain. As I pulled up to my gate, a cold feeling washed over me. I got out of the truck and walked to my front door. I pulled out my key, the same key I had used for years. I put it in the lock. It wouldn't go in all the way. I tried again, jiggling it gently. Nothing. I knelt down and looked closely. The lock was new. The familiar, weathered bronze of my old lock set was gone, replaced by a shiny, cheap-looking brass deadbolt. While I was building a case based on facts and evidence, she had made her next move. She had changed the locks. I was now, officially, locked out of my own home. I stood on my own porch, staring at the alien brass lock on my door, and felt a surge of cold fury. This was a direct physical challenge. It was one thing to fight with forged papers and lies on Facebook. It was another thing entirely to put a piece of metal between me and my home. My first instinct was to break a window. My second was to call Deputy Ruiz and demand he do something. I did neither. Acting on emotion was Karen's strategy, not mine. I took a deep breath, walked back to my truck, and pulled out my phone. I didn't call the sheriff. I called a 24-hour locksmith. Yes, I'm at 12 Mountain View Ridge. I'm the homeowner, and I've been illegally locked out of my house. I have my deed and my driver's license with me to prove ownership. I need you to open the door and rekey the locks. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then a gruff voice said, "Be there in 45 minutes." While I waited, I organized my documents. I put my driver's license and the original county-filed copy of my deed in my jacket pocket. When the locksmith's van pulled up, a man with a graying beard and a no-nonsense look on his face stepped out. He introduced himself as Earl. I explained the situation briefly, an HOA president with a power trip. He just grunted, not surprised in the slightest. "Happens more than you think," he said. He looked at my ID, then carefully inspected my deed under the beam of his flashlight, checking the official seal. "All right, Mr. Jensen, this all looks legit. Let's get you back in." As he began to work on the new lock, I saw headlights coming up the driveway. It was Karen's sedan. She parked behind the locksmith's van, blocking us in, and stormed toward the porch, a phone pressed to her ear. "They're trying to break in!" She shrieked into the phone. "The unstable man I told you about. He's hired a criminal to help him." Earl, the locksmith, didn't even flinch. He continued to work, his tools making small, precise clicks. Karen marched right up the steps and got in his face. "You need to stop this immediately. This property is under the control of the HOA. Your work is illegal." Earl slowly turned his head and looked her up and down. "Ma'am," he said, his voice flat and calm, "this man has a legal, state-recognized deed to this property. You have a piece of paper from your club. In the eyes of the law, he's the owner. I'm legally required to give him access to his property. Now please step back. You're in my light." He then held up another piece of paper she'd taped to the door, a ridiculous notice of HOA lock order. Earl flicked it with his finger. "And this? This has no legal weight. You can't vote against gravity, and you can't vote against a property deed. It's a foundational law of the country." With a final, satisfying click, the lock disengaged. The door swung open. Earl looked at me and nodded. "You're in. I'll rekey it for you now." I thanked him and stepped inside. As Earl worked on installing a new, high-quality deadbolt, I pulled out my phone and started recording again. I did a slow, methodical sweep of every room. The house was a mess, but a tidy mess. In my closet, her brightly colored clothes were hanging next to my old jackets. Her makeup was spread all over the bathroom counter. On my desk in the study, where I kept my fire service medals and a picture of Eleanor, were stacks of HOA paperwork. There were binders labeled violations and dues. Scattered among them were pages of what looked like a bizarre inspection checklist she had created for my home. Living room, adequate lighting, community standard met. Kitchen, appliances functional, community standard met. It was the diary of a delusional tyrant. I filmed every detail, making sure to get clear shots of her belongings in every room. This was no longer just about trespassing. This was about establishing the full scope of her invasion. Just as I finished filming the upstairs, I heard shouting from the foyer. Karen was back, and she wasn't alone. She had 2 men with her. I recognized them as the Miller brothers, Tom and Brett, 2 HOA enforcers who loved to play cop. They wore cheap, polyester security uniforms and had shiny, fake badges clipped to their pockets. "There he is," Karen yelled, pointing at me as I came down the stairs. "Remove him from the property." Tom and Brett, puffed up with self-importance, started toward me. "Sir, you've been ordered to vacate the premises by the Homeowners Association," Tom said, trying to sound official. "We're going to have to ask you to come with us." I stood my ground on the bottom step. My heart was pounding, but my voice was calm. "You're not police officers. Your badges are fake. And you are standing in my house. You are the ones who need to leave. Now." Brett, the younger brother, took another step forward, reaching for my arm. Before he could touch me, Earl the locksmith stepped between us. He was a big guy, much bigger than I'd realized. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, son," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This is a legal repossession by the rightful owner. If you lay a hand on him, it's assault. If you refuse to leave, it's criminal trespass. I am a licensed and bonded witness to this entire event, and I've already called the sheriff's department. They're on their way." The mention of real police made the Miller brothers hesitate. Their blustering confidence evaporated. They looked at Karen, suddenly unsure of themselves. The absurdity of it all hit me. Two guys with mail order badges trying to throw me out of my own home, stopped by a locksmith. Karen's carefully constructed world of fake authority was beginning to crumble against the simple, hard reality of the law. The arrival of Deputy Ruiz a few minutes later broke the tense standoff. The Miller brothers' fake authority dissolved completely in the presence of a real badge and gun. After a quick look at my deed, my ID, and the locksmith's official work order, Ruiz turned to Karen and her makeshift security. "You all need to leave this property immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This is Mr. Jensen's home." Karen began to sputter about HOA bylaws and emergency actions, but Ruiz cut her off. "This is now a criminal investigation. Anything you say can be used against you. Leave." They retreated, a pathetic-looking trio, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was alone in my own home. The feeling of victory was short-lived, replaced by a deep sense of violation. I spent the next few hours bagging up Karen's belongings, her clothes, her makeup, her stacks of HOA propaganda, and leaving them in a neat pile on the front porch. Every item I touched felt like an intrusion, a reminder of how deeply she had embedded herself in my life. The next morning, I realized the community was no longer a united front against me. The HOA's overreach had finally gone too far. My neighbor, Mr. Harrison, the one with the Ring camera, was the first to approach me. He was a retired Marine, a man who valued order and the chain of command, and what Karen had done had deeply offended his sense of right and wrong. "Mark," he said, standing on my porch, his face grim, "I need to show you something." He handed me a folded piece of paper. It was an emergency proxy vote form, signed by him, giving Karen his full voting rights at any emergency meeting. But he pointed to the bottom of the page. "She asked me to sign it 2 months ago," he explained. "She said it was just a formality in case of a wildfire evacuation, so the board could make quick decisions about clearing brush. The form was completely blank when I signed it. She filled in all this nonsense about your property later." He looked ashamed, but resolute. "I'll sign an affidavit. I'll testify." What she did was wrong. His confession was the first crack in Karen's wall of lies. It proved she had planned this deception for months. Later that day, another neighbor came forward. It was Linda Green, the widow who had given me the memo about the fake emergency meeting. She was a gentle soul, and I could tell coming to me was difficult for her. She was clutching a stack of printed emails. "Mark, I think you should see these," she said softly. The emails were a correspondence between her and Karen over the past several weeks. In one, Karen offered to waive Linda's HOA dues for the rest of the year if she would support the board's efforts to secure the abandoned property at my address. In another, Karen implied that if Linda didn't support her, she might find herself facing fines for the old oak tree in her yard, which Karen suddenly deemed a potential hazard. It was a clear-cut case of bribery and extortion. Linda felt terrible. "I never agreed to anything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I was scared. Since my husband died, I've been worried about money." I reassured her that she had done the right thing by coming forward. Her emails were solid gold. They showed Karen wasn't just a squatter. She was a predator, using her position to manipulate vulnerable residents. With these new pieces of evidence, Mr. Harrison's sworn affidavit about the forged proxy and Linda Green's emails, I knew I had to organize everything in a way that was impossible to misunderstand. I bought a 3-inch binder and a set of tab dividers. I began to construct a timeline of Karen's entire operation, starting from day 1. I labeled the first tab, July 3, the invasion, and behind it, I placed the water and electric bills, showing the first spike in usage, alongside the video of her moving her luggage into my house. The next tab was July 5, the business begins, containing the screenshots of the first Airbnb booking and review. Tab after tab, I built the story. July 9, the forged proxy, with Mr. Quote. Harrison's statement. July 12, the smear campaign, with printouts of the HOA's safety notice and her Facebook post. Every piece of paper was dated, highlighted, and cross-referenced. The final binder was a meticulous, undeniable account of fraud, theft, and manipulation. I drove it down to the sheriff's station and handed it to Deputy Ruiz. He spent nearly an hour flipping through it, silent and focused. When he was done, he closed the binder and looked at me. "Mark," he said, "this is one of the most thorough civilian investigative files I've ever seen. This is enough. I'm personally walking this over to the county prosecutor's office and looping in the state fraud task force." You did it. The relief was immense. I felt the heavy weight I'd been carrying for weeks finally begin to lift. But my ordeal wasn't over. Karen Whitfield was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are at their most dangerous. 2 days later, as I was sitting on my porch, enjoying the first real cup of coffee in my own home since this all began, a sheriff's car pulled into my driveway. It wasn't Deputy Ruiz. It was a younger deputy I didn't recognize. He got out of his car holding a piece of paper. "Mark Jensen?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm serving you with a temporary restraining order," he said, handing me the document. I read it in disbelief. Karen Whitfield had filed for an order of protection against me, claiming I was harassing her, stalking her, and had made her fear for her life. The order stated that I was to remain at least 100 feet away from her person and her residence at all times. The judge, seeing an address listed for her, had signed it. The address she had listed as her residence was 12 Mountain View Ridge. My address. My home. The deputy looked at me with a pained expression. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "Until the hearing, you're legally required to stay off your own property." The legal system, the very thing I was relying on for justice, had just been turned against me in the most perverse way imaginable. And I was once again an exile, standing at my own gate. The night I spent sleeping in the driver's seat of my truck, parked just beyond the 100-foot line of my own property, was the longest night of my life. The mountain air grew cold, and a damp chill settled into my bones. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the lights of my house, my sanctuary, glowing warmly in the distance, occupied by a thief who was using the law to keep me out. It was a new low. Humiliation is a cold, heavy blanket, but as the sun finally rose over the peaks, I didn't feel defeated. I felt focused. I pulled out a small notebook and a pen. I wrote down the date and the time. Then I wrote, "Forced to sleep in truck due to fraudulent restraining order. Cost, 1 night's lost sleep, diesel for truck heater, dignity." I decided then and there that I would document this final injustice with the same methodical calm as I had all the others. This wasn't just about getting my house back anymore. It was about making sure every lie she told had a price. The hearing was scheduled for a week later. In that week, Karen enjoyed the full comfort of my home while I lived out of my RV, now parked at a nearby campsite. She was a celebrity in her own mind, the brave HOA president who had stood up to a dangerous man, but her stage was about to collapse. On the morning of the hearing, I put on my best suit, the one I hadn't worn since Eleanor's funeral. I walked into the courthouse with my thick evidence binder tucked under my arm. It felt as solid and real as a block of granite. And Karen was already there, sitting with her lawyer, dressed in a conservative navy blue suit. She looked the part of the respectable community leader, the victim. She shot me a look of pure loathing as I sat down. When the judge called our case, Karen's lawyer went first. He painted a picture of a devoted, selfless HOA president, forced to take unfortunate but necessary action to protect an abandoned property. He described me as an unstable and aggressive man who had returned unexpectedly and had been terrorizing poor Mrs. Whitfield ever since. Karen took the stand and gave a tearful performance, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she described her fear. She waved her forged emergency transfer document as if it were the Declaration of Independence. Then it was my turn. I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't need one. I was just a man with the truth. I walked to the plaintiff's table, placed my binder on it with a solid thud, and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady. "My name is Mark Jensen. I am a retired firefighter. The woman who just testified is currently living in my house, a house I built with my own hands." For the next 20 minutes, I walked the judge through the binder. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I just presented the facts, one exhibit at a time. "Exhibit A?" I said, holding up the county-filed title deed. "This shows I own the property." "Exhibit B, the utility bills. They show the exact date and time the house became occupied, corresponding to my departure." "Exhibit C, the video logs. This shows Mrs. Whitfield moving her luggage into my home," I continued, page after page. I showed him the forged proxy form from Mr. Harrison. I presented the emails where Karen attempted to bribe and threaten Linda Green. The judge's expression grew more and more serious with each piece of evidence. Karen and her lawyer began whispering frantically. Finally, I reached the last section. "And Exhibit G, Your Honor, the source of all this. This is a printout of a short-term rental listing. The host's name is Kate. The property being rented is my home. I laid out the screenshots of the bookings, the guest reviews, and the payment confirmations from the rental company, which Deputy Ruiz had managed to get expedited. In the 2 weeks she occupied my home under the guise of an emergency, Mrs. Whitfield collected $6,300 in rental fees." I closed the binder. The courtroom was silent. The judge looked down at the stack of evidence, then over at Karen. He peered at her over the top of his reading glasses. "Mrs. Whitfield?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "I have just one question for you. Why is your name, Karen Whitfield, listed as the recipient on the bank payout emails from this Airbnb account?" Karen's face went white. Her composure, the carefully constructed mask of the victim, shattered. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her lawyer stood up and said, "Your Honor, we object," but the judge cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Sit down, counsel. I'm waiting for an answer from your client." Silence stretched across the room. There was no answer. There was no lie big enough to cover this. The judge looked from her to the 2 sheriff's deputies standing against the back wall. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As the deputies began to walk forward, a small metallic sound echoed in the quiet room. It was the click of handcuffs. They placed Karen Whitfield under arrest, right there in the courtroom, for perjury, wire fraud, and grand theft. The restraining order was immediately dissolved. As they led her away, a few of my neighbors, who had come to watch, including Mr. Harrison and Linda Green, broke into quiet, respectful applause. Deputy Ruiz met me in the hallway. He shook my hand firmly. "The fraud task force will handle the rest," he said. "The HOA board is under state audit, and I hear they're all resigning." He handed me a piece of paper. It was an official order restoring my full and immediate possession of my property. That afternoon, I drove back up the mountain. I walked up to my front door and used the new key Earl the locksmith had given me. It slid in smoothly and turned with a satisfying click. I stepped inside. The house was empty, silent. It was just a house again. My house. I went out onto the back porch and made a cup of coffee. The sun was warm on my face, and the mountains stood silent and majestic, just as they always had. Karen thought she could own my home by creating her own rules, her own reality, through a storm of paper and lies. But she learned a hard lesson. The truth doesn't need a vote. It doesn't need an HOA bylaw. Like gravity, it just is. And in the end, gravity always wins.